Well, good afternoon, everyone. Gil and your team, and it's a wonderful thing to come back to my hometown. I was born in Edmonton, and I always get a chuckle when I'm in anywhere in Canada talking about what a rabble-rouser left-wing pinko I am. And then people say, where are you from? And I say, I'm from Alberta. And then they say, what? And it's part of this stereotype, of course, that Alberta and social justice are two words you never hear in the same sentence. But of course, that isn't at all the history of Alberta, and we all know that in this room. You are the ones who've been building social justice here and making the best of what we can in a conservative, business-friendly environment. The purpose of my presentation is to talk about unions, the role unions play, how unions build a stronger society, including a stronger Alberta. I'll put up a few links there for folks who want more information afterwards. There's my Twitter handle if anyone wants to follow that. The Policy Alternatives website. You heard from Armin today, of course, who does wonderful work for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. The next one underneath is the Progressive Economics Forum, which is a blog site where we put together different information on economics from a progressive or labor-friendly point of view. And then the last one, economicsforeveryone.ca, is a website for the book that I wrote called Economics for Everyone. And it is meant to be a textbook for trade unionists and other activists to learn about economics in a sort of a common sense way rather than in the conventional classroom supply equals demand way that is sometimes taught in our universities and colleges. I actually want to start this talk with a little bit of an economics lesson just to remind ourselves and everybody else about where the wealth that we produce actually comes from. What we call value added. GDP is nothing other than the sum total of all the value added in our economy. Where does that value added actually come from? Well, guess what? It all starts with what we find in nature around us, and of course Alberta is lucky in terms of the wealth and breadth of resources in nature around us. But from that point on, every penny of value added that's created in our economy is created through the sweat and effort and brains and brawn and commitment of working people like yourselves and the members of your union. And this is a fundamental economic point that is obscured and forgotten and deliberately brushed under the carpet by those who want us to forget where the wealth came from in the first place. Now, when I say work, I mean work in a very general sense. Obviously, the physical labor that we conduct, but also the mental or intellectual labor, the thinking, the writing, the analyzing, the problem solving. I refer to the direct production of goods and services that we need and use and consume in our lives, but I also refer to the indirect work that we do, producing tools and equipment and machinery that are valuable not for their own right, but because they help us to do other work. That's still work. It doesn't matter whether you work for an hourly wage or whether you earn a monthly salary. You are still working for someone else. They tell you what to do. They own your work, and they will kick you out on the street as soon as you are no longer required to them. So this artificial distinction between workers and professionals is less and less meaningful, isn't it? Because with technology and outsourcing and everything else, the geologist can lose their job because they found someone cheaper as quickly as a factory worker. In fact, if anything, some of the professionals are the most exploited of all, because there's no assembly line worker in Canada who would agree to work all evening and half the weekend, not just for no premium, but for no money, period, right? That's called exploitation, my friends, and that's what many professional workers experience. And of course, it doesn't matter whether you're working in the public sector or in the private sector, whether you're producing goods and services for a company that sells them for profit, or whether you're producing services that are consumed by your colleagues in society because of their inherent good. It's all work, it's all production, and it is the sole source of the value that's added to the goods and gifts that we receive from nature around us. Everything that happens in our economy involves the application of productive human effort or work to those products that we find in nature to make them more useful and to create our standard of living. Now, this is something that you should be able to understand while you just look around you at society and watch people work and live and get around. But it is the economics profession and the media and the politicians and the business lobbyists go to great lengths to try and hide this fundamental fact and confuse it. So in the course of all of this work, who does what? Well, it is the workers. It is working people of all those different shapes and sizes and colors and levels of education who do that actual work. What does the boss actually do? Well, the boss performs certain functions that are important in the economy. There's no doubt about it. In our system, in our economic system, where the majority of production takes place within private for-profit companies, then you need that company to initiate some kind of an investment at the beginning to create the business, create the jobs, and start the production process. You would obviously need managers to organize the process to make sure that everything is fitting together, that we have the supplies and services that we need, that the machinery isn't breaking down. Now, I will point out, managers in most cases are salaried workers themselves. So in that regard, management and supervision is actually just one kind of the work that goes on in our economy. The owner of the company isn't necessarily productive. The owner isn't actually necessarily doing anything other than sitting there clipping coupons at the end of the day. And this is what's often forgotten and obscured when we think about who does what, and then the obvious next question, who gets what in our economy, and how the different players in the economy receive income as a result of the work that goes on. In our system, businesses receive a profit. Profit is the surplus that's left over after the owner of the business has paid for the initial investment, hired and paid the workers, paid for the parts, supplies, and materials, and then sold the output. They get all the money, they pay the bills, and what's left is the profit. So in that regard, it's a residual or a surplus. And the size of that surplus depends completely on how much they had to pay for those different inputs. And of course, the most important input in the economy as a whole is the cost of the labor that's required to make that work happen in the first place. So the employer constantly has an incentive to try and get workers to provide more work effort, more brains, more brawn, more determination, more commitment, more unpaid overtime, if you like, to their tasks in return for less labor cost. And that effort to extract work from the workers in return for as little payment in terms of wages, salaries, and benefits is a defining feature of how our economy works. Their goal is to minimize the unit labor cost of production. That means not just cutting your wages and salaries as much as possible, it also means boosting your productivity as much as possible in order that that surplus that's left over at the end of the day is as fat as possible. And in Alberta, it's fat, believe me, which leads me to why I think this is all relevant to the Alberta situation as much as or more as anywhere else in Canada. The distribution of income in our economy ultimately is determined by the extent to which employers are successful in that effort to extract maximum labor effort from the workers in return for minimum cost. And that is dependent on the relative power, the bargaining power, if you like, but also the economic power, the political power, even the cultural power of employers versus workers in any given society at any given point in time. It is not determined, I emphasize, the wage that people make in society is not determined by the forces of supply and demand. This is part of their effort to obscure the whole process by which distribution is determined. In fact, supply never equals demand in the labor market. The labor market is a very unique market. It's a market for human beings, okay? Human beings who are alive, who think, who have agency, and labor supply never equals labor demand. There is always people around who don't have a job. In fact, the system is managed in a way to make sure that there are always people around who don't have a job. Because the fact that there are people around who don't have a job, who are vulnerable, who are suffering, is an important disciplining device on how the overall labor relations framework occurs. If, in fact, employment was truly full employment, supply actually equaled demand, and unemployment was zero, you could get fired, you could get your ass fired one day, walk down the street, find another job in an instant, paying exactly the same amount of wages as you made in the last job. Is that a situation that employers want? Not on your life. We have experienced that situation once in Canada. There was one time in our history when we were truly constrained by the number of workers who were available. Anybody guess what I'm thinking of? World War II, exactly. Here we had a moment in our history where we'd actually gone from mass unemployment, where there was too much unemployment for the health of the system, to one where almost overnight everybody was at work. In fact, so much so that they then went to get women and recruit women to work in addition to the work they were doing at home, of course, the unpaid work, to come into the formal workplace to help with that production effort. And it was a whole exercise to maximize as much output as possible because of this emergency that we faced as a society. And that's an interesting lesson in a way. At that moment in time, our economy was not guided, first and foremost, by what is profitable for private business. At that moment in time, our economy was guided by something else. What can we do as a society to help address this enormous threat that humanity faces? And we will put all the resources that we can at it. And lo and behold, we did. We found work for everybody, productive work for everybody. And the incredible irony is, here we were in a world war, and the average standard of living of Canadians actually went up during the war, not down. I should clarify, that wasn't true for the soldiers, okay? The soldiers have faced particular problems of life expectancy, you might say. But for those who were fighting on the home front, their nutrition went up, their incomes went up, their health went up, even though the whole society was fighting this terrible challenge, which in a way tells us something. I can think of challenges today that we're facing that are different than the challenge we faced in World War II, but in some ways are just as scary. You know, if we think about climate change and what that's going to mean down the road, if we think about poverty and exclusion and inequality and what that's going to mean, I say, why don't we declare war on pollution and poverty and put everyone to work overnight, just like we did in World War II, and lo and behold, our standard of living would grow again. This point about the labor market is especially important here in Alberta, where you're constantly bombarded with this mythology that labor is scarce, right? That there's a shortage of skills, there's a shortage of workers, and that's why we have to import people from China to work for less than everybody else works under terrible working conditions under the temporary foreign worker program and elsewhere. And in fact, that is never, ever the case. Even in Alberta, the system does not guarantee a job for everyone who's capable of working, and that certainly isn't true elsewhere in Canada. This bargaining power relationship that ultimately shapes the division of the pie has many dimensions to it, many different economic, legal, and cultural factors that help to influence the level of distribution that's paid out to different groups in society, including legal standards, workers' expectations even, the mobility or flexibility of employers, the extent to which they can take the job somewhere else if they don't find a suitably compliant workforce here in Canada, productivity levels, and then the last one on that list is what we're here about today, which is collective bargaining and the institutions of collective bargaining, which are a crucial determinant of how that pie, the pie that we produce, gets divided up, and how much of the pie that we produce do we actually get. And in our market economy, the employment relationship, if you like, is very, very asymmetrical. It's again portrayed as if it was a trade between equals, supply and demand. You give something, the boss gives something, and we end up with a happy mutual exchange. That is not the case at all. It is an exchange, but it isn't an equal exchange, because workers and employers need each other in very, very different ways. For an individual worker, ultimately, you have to find a job to sell your brains and brawn in order to make money, to support yourself and your family, or else you're out of luck, right? That's really the only way we have. It's the only option that we have to support ourselves in society, is to find a job, keep a job, and hope that it pays for the bills at the end of the month. Work or starve is a bit of an exaggeration today, because we do have a minimal social safety net to take care of people to some degree if they don't have work. But you know that the safety net has been frayed beyond recognition. Most unemployed Canadians don't collect employment insurance at all, for example, and provincial welfare programs are horrible. And you always have the generosity of your family to fall back on. But the ultimate constraint, if you like, on an individual worker is they have to find a job and keep it in order to survive. In terms of the employer and their relationship with you as an individual worker, it's a very, very different story. They don't need you in any particular way, unless you have some kind of incredibly unique skill, like a Steve Jobs or a Wayne Gretzky, okay? The employer can live without you. They always live without you. They can always find somebody else to do your job. So in that regard, it's a very unequal exchange. You need the employer as an individual more than the employer needs you, so you know the employer is going to dictate the terms of the relationship. But in terms of the overall workforce that drives production and creates all of that value added in our economy, employers do need workers in aggregate, because without the workers in total, production would grind to a halt, there would be nothing that they could sell, and there would be no profit at the end of the day. So the way to solve the asymmetry in that relationship, that again is a fundamental feature of our economy, is to level the playing field. We have to go to the employer and speak with one voice, and that's what collective bargaining is all about. We have to be able to go to the employer and say, we're going to create a situation where you do need us as much as we need you. And then we have at least a fighting chance of getting a fair deal in terms of wages, benefits, pensions, working conditions, and all the other dimensions of the employment relationship. It was intuitively obvious to workers from the very beginning of capitalism that they would have a better shot if they could go to the boss together to negotiate rather than one-on-one to negotiate. One-on-one to negotiate, you'll get fired and replaced before you can even leave the boss's office. Go together to negotiate, suddenly the boss knows that they face a cost of not coming to a suitable disagreement. So workers understood this and tried to organize unions from the very early days of capitalism. For centuries, they were banned and suppressed, often violently, using all kinds of mumbo-jumbo about how this was a barrier to the forces of supply and demand. But we've already seen that distribution is not determined by the forces of supply and demand. Distribution is determined by power. And all we're doing with collective bargaining and forming unions is trying to give ourselves the power so that we can win a healthy share of the value added that we produce. So that's the economics lesson. Let's talk about what it's going to mean here in Alberta and why I think collective bargaining and the future of unions is as essential to social progress in Alberta as it is anywhere else in Canada. We have, of course, our immediate goals of collective bargaining. This is the bread and butter of you folks as leadership in your own unions, about wages, about other forms of compensation, about hours of work, about health and safety, and about everything else that we confront in the workforce. But there's also the impact of unions on the overall state of affairs in society in terms of winning higher share of the pie for workers in general, even for non-union workers. This is what's interesting. Non-union workers benefit when unions are strong, even if they themselves don't join the union, because the employer knows there's a threat that they might join the union. And the employer knows there's a demonstration effect where unionized workplaces show what's possible, so workers in non-union workplaces are going to demand it as well. So when unions are crushed, even someone who never had any intention of joining a union sees that their own bargaining power is reduced as a result. There's less income inequality when unions are strong. There's better social security programs when unions are strong. And that's because unions serve as a general voice for working people in our overall society, not just within a given workplace, but in terms of being able to comment on issues like the temporary foreign worker issue. Who is going to take on an issue like that if you don't have organized labor and its voice in order to speak up for things that affect workers, even if it isn't our own members directly? So my argument is that collective bargaining is needed more in Alberta than anywhere else in Canada. And that seems like a funny argument to make, but I'll show you why I think it's true. Because even in Alberta, with all its oil wealth and its booming economy and the strong business investment, even in Alberta, the average individual working person doesn't stand a chance at getting a decent share of the pie that they produced unless they band together arm in arm with their colleagues and go to the boss as one to demand a fair share of the pie that they produce. So let me go through a few charts and graphs. I know it's the end of a long day, so I hope I don't put anyone to sleep on this score. They say an economist is someone who's good with numbers but didn't have the personality to become an accountant. So I'll just say that as a warning before I start putting up the charts and graphs here. Here's the first one. This is a graph that shows average hourly wages by province in Canada, okay, measured as a percent of the Canadian average, okay? So if you're over 100%, then you're higher than the average, and if you're below 100%, you're obviously below the average. Now, Alberta is the highest in the province, okay, in the country. So there's no doubt wages in Alberta are high relative to elsewhere, and there's a number of reasons for that. One thing to note, they aren't that high relative to the rest of the country, okay? Here's Alberta with its booming economy, everything's hunky-dory, and so-called labor shortage. Average wages are 9% higher than they are in Ontario, home of the Rust Belt, okay? High unemployment, plant closures all over the place, and the best that the system can deliver for workers in Alberta is a 9% premium over and above what they're making in Ontario. And I stress this is just the wage in nominal dollars, okay? We haven't started to look at anything about cost of living in Alberta. We'll do that in a minute. So, yes, wages are high in Alberta, slightly high relative to the rest of the country. Now let's adjust this graph and add in how much do workers in Alberta produce relative to the rest of the country? Okay, what is their productivity? What is the size of the pie that Albertans are producing? Yes, we're getting a slightly bigger slice of the pie, but how big is the pie in general? Here's what's striking. There's the productivity in each province measured, again, relative to 100% of the Canadian average. And you see, now you're talking about something that's a different order of magnitude relative to the other provinces. GDP per capita in Alberta is 140% higher than it is in Canada as a whole. So you get wages that are, roughly about 15% higher, but you're producing 40% more per worker than in Canada as a whole. Now, the interesting thing to note here, there's 3 provinces that are above 100%, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. So they are the 3 provinces blessed with petroleum. So that's what determines it right now. It isn't about skills. It isn't about productivity. It certainly isn't about work effort. The boom in the economy is determined purely by what happens to be buried in the ground under your feet, okay, which puts another twist on the Alberta advantage. I got a kick out of the other provinces like in Ontario and BC, which used to be have provinces before the whole global commodities boom came along. And conservative politicians stand up and say, we used to be a have province, now we're not a have province, and if I'm elected, we're going to be a have province once again. Which makes me wonder how they know the oil is buried somewhere, because in Canada, that's the only way to become a have province, is to discover large quantities of oil. So here's an interesting comparison. In some provinces, the red bar is higher than the blue bar, okay? So in some provinces, the relative productivity is much higher than the relative wage, if you like, and Alberta is like that. In other provinces, the reverse is true. In other provinces, their relative wage is higher than you'd think it would be if all you looked at was the size of the pie that's being produced. And this immediately verifies the point that we made in our little economics lesson, that distribution is about power, institutions, legal context, collective bargaining, expectations, all of those non-market factors that we went through and talked about. Because otherwise, there's no way to explain why Ontario, despite the terrible economic times that it's been through, has the second highest wages in Canada and not that far behind Alberta. So now we'll do another graph where we're going to look at the difference between the red bar and the blue bar, okay? And that's what this is. This is looking at the gap, if you like, between wages and productivity. What is the wages relative to the Canadian average minus the productivity relative to the Canadian average, if you can follow that. In fact, if you can follow that, you get a free beer courtesy of the AFL at the end of this class because you're doing very well.
CAW has much deeper pockets.
So you notice that Alberta is unique in this regard. The gap between productivity and wages is bigger in Alberta than it is anywhere else in Canada. The 3 provinces where workers are not getting the full share of the pie are, in fact, the 3 oil-producing provinces. Elsewhere, relatively speaking, workers are getting the share of the pie, and in general, the size of those differences in other provinces reflects the overall state of those institutional and power issues that I was talking about. So why is it that workers in Alberta are getting a uniquely small share of the pie, given how big the pie that's being produced in Alberta is? Now we bring in the issue of consumer prices as well, because I don't have to tell you folks about the cost of living in Alberta and the pressures that have resulted from this kind of unmanaged gold rush energy boom. And if you adjust the wage growth in recent years for the growth in consumer prices, you find out Alberta's performance has been ho-hum at best. This ranks the provinces in Canada according to the average annual growth in real median wages over the last 5 years. So this is wages, the median wage, that's like the wage of the very middle worker, adjusted for inflation over those last 5 years. And in Alberta, at least it grew. That's a positive thing, okay? But it didn't grow very fast. It grew by 1% and a bit, barely more than the Canadian average. And in fact, the Canadian average was pulled down by Ontario, where things have been terrible, and similarly to a lesser degree by Quebec. Every other province did better than Alberta in terms of the actual improvement in the real standard of living of workers, despite having an economy that wasn't anywhere near as dynamic and productive and growing as Alberta's was. Alberta ranks 8 out of 10 provinces according to real wage growth over the last 5 years, which again raises the question, well, if all we have to do is produce a really, really big pie and then we'll get a really big share out of it, how do you explain this graph? You can't explain this graph except by looking at Alberta's uniquely anti-labor, legal, institutional, and cultural context to explain why workers are getting a small share of the pie. This is an interesting graph that talks about why the provinces that have petroleum industries also have very uniquely low labor rates, very uniquely low wages relative to the productivity of their economies. This is a graph that ranks the main industrial sectors in Canada according to how much profit is paid out in those sectors, again on average over several years, relative to how much is paid to the workers in each sector. So, of course, remember, it is work, broadly defined, that created all of that value added. Even the so-called capital that is invested in the form of tools and machinery and equipment, in terms of real machinery, those are things that were produced by other workers. That's just another form of work, an indirect form of work. So the level of profits that's paid out in each industry reflects all kinds of things, including the market power of the companies, the scarcity, if you like, of whatever it is that they're producing. That's important in the case of mining and petroleum products. The level of competition in the industry, and so on. Right at the top by a country mile is the mining and petroleum sector, which pays out almost $5 in profit for every dollar that is paid to the workers who actually dig the stuff out of the ground. And obviously, you know, there's large amounts of money that's invested in these companies, and the people who own that money want to get a good return. But guess what? Money doesn't produce anything. It's people who go out there and put their sweat and effort and brawn on the job, and their brains and their problem solving and their analytical skills on the job to explain why this resource is being produced in the first place. Yet the distribution of income in that industry is uniquely skewed towards ownership rather than work, and that explains why the provinces which have the biggest petroleum industries are the ones that have the smallest labor share of total output. We've also seen a correlation between the petroleum industry and the growing inequality within society, let alone the distribution of income between workers and owners, which we've been talking about. We can also think about the distribution of income between different households, between different families in society. And this is where, again, Alberta shows that this rough and ready approach, if you like, is concentrating the gains of economic growth at the very top. This shows a change in the income share that was received by the top quintile, the wealthiest fifth, if you like, of society. That's a tough one to say, especially after a beer, which we get at the end of the day because people understood that double negative wage productivity relationship. Okay? The wealthiest fifth is collecting the bulk of the income gains, and we see that in Saskatchewan and Alberta, more so than anywhere else in Canada. Every other province, the rich have been getting richer, we know that, except for Prince Edward Island, where somehow the reverse happens, so that's kind of interesting. And then you can also look at what's happening in the middle class. We've also talked about the decline in the middle income groups, okay? And here again, Alberta is actually now the absolute worst. If we take the middle 3 quintiles. The axis label on that graph is wrong. I'm sorry, I forgot to change the axis label. This is the middle 3 quintiles of the population. Alberta's had the biggest loss of middle-class income of any province in Canada. And again, Prince Edward Island had an increase at the other end. They must have had some kind of revolution out there, I guess. But because PEI is so small, we never heard about it. That's the only place where the rich got poorer and the middle class got richer. So I don't know, I guess it's Anne of Green Gables' heritage or something like that. We'll have to go out there and figure out what's going on in PEI. Elsewhere in Canada, the reverse is happening, and it's happening faster in Alberta than anywhere else. So how do we explain, by all of those measures, Alberta's distribution of income between workers and owners is uniquely skewed? Alberta's workers, despite all of this rhetoric about labor being a scarce commodity, Alberta's workers are getting a smaller share relative to their productivity than anyone else in Canada. The middle class incomes are shrinking as a share of the total, and the high income groups are rising. This isn't just about getting more wages. I want to emphasize that. Of course, getting better living conditions, wages, benefits, and security is always a central issue in our bargaining. But it's also about getting some respect, getting some security, and having an impact on the evolution of overall society. These are the things that unions do as well, in addition to negotiating better wages and pensions and benefits. It's especially important in a place like Alberta, where so much of the wealth production is tied up with natural resources. And we know those natural resources aren't going to be here forever. And we know that we may not even be able to use them forever. There may be reasons why we can't use them even before they run out. So we're going to make huge decisions over how we utilize the resource wealth that we were blessed with. And if unions don't have the power to influence those decisions, we're going to end up having an extractive boom that leaves us with a hole in the ground, right? Rather than a process of developing our resources in a way that lifts our economy and leaves us better capable of producing stuff in the future. When I think about resource-driven economies, I think of 2 extremes. I think on the positive hand, I think about a country like Norway, okay, which also has a lot of oil. It's about the same size in population as Alberta is, so it's not that much different. Anything that happened in Norway could conceivably happen here. They have oil wealth, but they've maintained public control and public ownership over the wealth. They've invested the profits instead of having them paid out in dividends to private owners. And the standard of living in Norway, according to the United Nations Development Program, is higher than anywhere else in the world because they've taken that money, along with the taxes that they continue to collect, and invested it in education, healthcare, and communities. That's the positive extreme. The negative extreme of a society that's rich for a while you're digging out the resource, okay, and then is left devastated once the resource is either gone or can't be used anymore. The other extreme is an island in the Pacific called Nauru. Have you ever heard of this place? It's an island that literally was built on bird shit, okay? I know that sounds bizarre, but it is. It was millions and millions of years of bird poop accumulating, okay? And then there was an island, and you could actually live on there. Well, they discovered in the late 1800s that this was fabulous fertilizer. So global companies came in, dug up all the bird shit, hired the people in Nauru to work for a while, okay? And for over a decade, Nauru had the highest GDP per capita of anywhere in the world because of the value of the bird shit that was extracted. So guess what happened when A, the bird shit was gone, okay, and B, they discovered other forms of fertilizer. There's a hole in the ground in Nauru, the people are in poverty, and there's nothing left there. Their new industry in Nauru is a prison camp for illegal, so-called illegal boat people who are captured in Australia and shipped to a prison camp in Nauru. Okay, so now that's a uniquely horrible experience, but that shows the risks of treating a resource extraction boom as just easy money, okay? You can't run it that way. You have to think about it in terms of developing the capacity of your economy to produce good things that lift the standard of living of everyone long after the resource is gone. And the role of unions in Alberta is more than just what we're able to bargain for our members. It's how we're able to shape the whole unfolding of this society as we move forward. And your leadership at the Alberta Fed have been absolutely courageous and very effective in how they've been trying to do that. The fact is, the institutional and power arrangements in Alberta reflect a deliberate effort to suppress wages, to suppress the share of the pie that's captured by workers, and to shift more power to employers. And that's what explains all of those other graphs that I just showed, that Alberta has the lowest unionization rate, the lowest minimum wage, weak protections for workers, has exploited temporary foreign workers and other vulnerable groups, and in general, has tried to manage development in a way that takes an already profitable business sector in Alberta and makes it even more profitable than it was before. So here is the graph that explains the other graphs, the fact that the unionization rate in Alberta is lower than it is, again, by a significant amount than elsewhere in Canada. So this is, again, where I come and say something that seems quite counterintuitive, considering everybody thinks that the streets are paved with gold in Alberta. And you and I know that they aren't. Workers and everyone in Alberta need unions more here than anywhere else in Canada, because you'll never get a decent share of the pie that you produce, and you'll never get the security that you deserve without the unions to be your collective voice with the boss and with government. That's the bottom line. So unions are essential to building a prosperous society, more so today than ever, and more so in Alberta than anywhere else in Canada. No society has ever attained true mass prosperity without strong unions and without widespread collective bargaining. Even a wealthy capitalist economy where an individual worker has to go to the boss, one worker against the boss, and ask for whatever they can get, will never have a situation where the large numbers of people have a decent middle-class lifestyle with the hope and security that comes with that. And that's why we're here. I think there's a terrible myth out there in Alberta and in the rest of Canada as well, that Alberta is somehow this business oasis, you know, this free market outpost, a place that got rich because people gave business more power and more freedom and freed the private sector to do their thing. That is an unbelievable myth. Alberta is not a business province. Alberta is a working class province. If you walk around the streets here, if you watch people driving and moving, if you watch people working, if you watch people digging up resources and processing them and adding value, if you watch people providing services for each other, who is it that's doing it? It's working people, your members, your neighbors. And this myth about Alberta being all for business has to get overthrown. This is a time for working people in Alberta to say, the benefits have not trickled down. That whole theory was wrong. This is not a business province. This is a workers' province. This is your time to take it back, and the people in this room are the ones to lead the way. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you.
Can you stick around for a couple
I can,
of questions?
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, good.